Hi, Jenny Montell here, Chief Economist and Data Director for IMPLAN. And in this video, I'm going to talk about IMPLAN's fully disclosed CEW data. We'll talk about what the data are, some key features, and important things to know about the data set. And then we'll dive into the methods we use to estimate non-disclosed values to create a fully disclosed data set. So what are the CEW data? CEW stands for Census of Employment and Wages, and it is a data set that is published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, on a quarterly and annual basis. And in this data set, it gives account of all the establishments, employment, and wages by industry. It's reported across 4 ownership types. There is federal government-owned establishments, state government-owned establishments, local government-owned establishments, and privately owned establishments. And it's reported at each of the 5 levels of industry detail in the North American Industry Classification System, also known as NAICS, from the 2-digit level, which is super aggregate, like it would be manufacturing as a whole, and then down to the 3-digit, which would be like non-durable manufacturing and durable manufacturing. And then the 4-digit, which is more detailed, 5-digit, more detailed, and 6-digit, the very most detailed, where it'd be some very specific type of manufacturing. Now, the reason it's called a census is because they're actual counts. These are not survey-based estimates, actual count compiled from administrative data from state and federal unemployment insurance programs. So it's very accurate for the type of employees covered. But important to note that not all types of employees are covered. It doesn't cover all jobs, but about 95% of US jobs. And we'll talk about exclusions in a little bit. It also contains non-disclosed records. So it has data for counties, states, and the US as a whole for all these ownership types and all these industries. But there are suppressed values that the government does intentionally to protect the privacy of firms that might be able to be identified by the data. And so they'll have a record that'll tell you the industry name and code for that county, and the number of establishments in that industry, but it'll be missing the associated employment and wages data for that record. And we're going to see that in the next slide. So in this slide, I just have a snapshot, a sample of some real raw CEW data for Fremont County, Colorado. But this is just a snapshot of real data. There's another 3-digit mining sector in this county, which would make up the remaining 5 establishments. And it has its own 4-digit children with their own 5-digit children and their own 6-digit children. So as you can see, let's just look at the first line here for NAICS code 21. That's the most aggregate. It gets 2 digits. And you can see that there are 12 establishments. Underneath that, we see one of the 3-digit children, which is mining except for oil and gas, and it has 7 establishments. So that means that there's some other 3-digit child sector that has the other 5 establishments. It might be oil and gas mining. I was just showing you this, a subset of all the data for Fremont County, Colorado, so you could get a sense of it. It wouldn't all fit well on a slide if I put all the records. Okay, so here I just kind of wanted to show you the different levels of NAICS codes and how they roll up into one another. And I also wanted to point out that you could see that in the last 2 records here, the 6-digit most detailed NAICS codes or industry codes have a disclosure code of N. And you will also see that there isn't any information on employment or wages for those 2 records. That's because these are non-disclosed, again. But we're really lucky that in the CEW data, the establishment count is always disclosed. And that's what really helps us be able to get good employment and wages estimates for those, because we at least know that that industry exists in this region and we know how many establishments in that industry there are. So if you're looking at raw CEW data ever, please note that if an industry doesn't exist in that region, there won't even be a record for it. So it's not like there will be a 0 in the establishment counts. It just won't even show up. So if the sector exists, there will be a record for it in the CEW data, and it will at least have an establishment count. Okay. So that's a look at the raw data. Now let's talk about some of those exclusions I mentioned. One of the most important exclusions is proprietors. Most proprietors are not going to show up in the CEW data. The only way they would is if the proprietor paid themselves as a wage and salary employee, which some small business owners apparently do. So in that case, they'll be in there, but most proprietors will not be in this data set. Now, if a proprietorship has W-2 employees, those employees will be in this data set, even if the proprietor themselves is not in. Is not in there. So employees of proprietors will be in here. And proprietors can also be contractors. Remember that. Anyone who is not filling out a W-2 and is instead filling out another form, then they will be excluded. Okay, another big exclusion is undocumented workers. Of course, by definition, if you're undocumented, you're not sending in those forms to the IRS. And so there's just no record of you in this data set. So you won't be counted in this data set. Then there's some farm and domestic workers who are exempted from reporting their employment data, so they won't be included. Certain religious organizations and student employees. Most railroad workers, because they are covered by their own unemployment insurance system or programs, so they're not in there. Elected officials in the executive and legislative branches of government, members of the armed forces and commissioned corps or the commissioned corps of NOAA, individuals employed under a federal relief program or serving on a temporary basis in the case of a natural disaster or similar emergency, and then employees of certain national security agencies, they are excluded for their own security. Okay, a few other notes. The CEW data do undergo revisions, but they're usually pretty minor because these aren't modeled data that they're waiting for more survey responses and other sources of employment data that undergo bigger revisions, like the monthly employment report that the BLS puts out that is survey based, and it undergoes some pretty big revisions sometimes. These revisions here are very minor. IMPLAN uses the revised annual data. So that's what we're talking about here. Similarly, there's no process necessary for seasonal adjustment of these data because these aren't modeled estimates. They're actual counts, so they don't need to adjust for seasonality. But there is some indication of seasonality and in the sense of the duration of jobs in these data, because a job lasting 1/4 of the year will be reported as a quarter of a job, or 0.25 job. Same thing goes for establishments. An establishment existing for 2/4 of the year is reported as 0.5 of an establishment. So you do get a sense if a job was seasonal or not because of that. So that's great. There is no indication of hours worked. So we don't know if these jobs are full-time or part-time, just that they were a job, but we do get an indication of whether the job lasted the full year or not. All right, now let's get into some of the dirty details of processing the CEW data. All right, the main thing we do is estimating non-disclosure. So all those missing values. How do we do that? So there's several steps to this, several stages. First stage is just to get a first estimate. And we have 5 tiers of preferred options for estimating getting a first estimate. And it just depends on what other data sources are available for that particular industry and that particular geography. Okay, so the first tier, our first choice, if it's available, is to use a raw CEW value from the previous year and just project it into the current year. And how we would project it is using state growth rate for that industry, or if the state value isn't available, using the US growth rate for that industry. If last year's lagged raw value was also non-disclosed, then we'll turn to a different method, and we use a different data source from the Census Bureau. They have something called county business patterns data. And we never use those data just straight up because they're always lagged a year relative to the CEW data. So they're always older. But so we wouldn't use their employment number as it stands, but we could use a ratio of the employment per establishment from that CBP data and multiply that by our establishment count from this year's CEW data for this place. Because remember, establishment counts are always disclosed in the CEW data, so we always have that. And so we can use the 1 year lagged ratio of employment to establishments times this year's, multiplied by this year's establishment count, and get a good first estimate of employment. If there are no CBP data for this particular county and industry, then we will go back 2 years in the raw CEW data and see if we can get a disclosed value from 2 years ago. And if so, we'll project that, again, using state growth rate if possible, or US growth rate if necessary. Our fourth option, if none of the first options work, is to then we're not going back in time any farther, but instead let's just look to our current CEW data. Let's look at the state. If we're trying to disclose a county value, let's look at the state value and see if the state's disclosed. And if the state's value is disclosed, we'll use the state's employment per establishment ratio and multiply that by our county's value for establishments. If the state's value is not disclosed, then we'll use the US value, the US ratio of employment per establishment in this NAICS code multiplied by the county's establishment count. Because remember, the US data are, for private ownership at least, are always disclosed. And so we know that if we've gotten to our fifth tier here, we are guaranteed that we have an estimate. We have a first estimate because US data are always disclosed. So that's our last choice, but it's our fallback. Okay, after we get a first estimate, we then need to do some more work. When we have a first estimate, things aren't going to always match up nicely where the sum of all the 6-digit NAICS codes probably won't sum up to their 5-digit parent, the estimate for the 5-digit parent. And the sum of the 5-digit codes likely won't sum up to the 4-digit parent because these are all just first estimates. So we need to do some of that cleaning up in that sense. So we're going to start by going bottom up. And by bottom up, we can start at the 6-digit level and then go upward. And we're going to replace non-disclosed parent sector values with the sum of their children if that sum is greater than the first estimate that we gave for that non-disclosed parent. So basically, we're giving them the bigger of the two. The parents will either keep their first estimate or we'll replace it with the sum of children if that's bigger. And just to point out here, we don't change any disclosed values. So if CEW gave us a raw number for a certain sector, that stands forever. We do not change that. We're only talking about adjusting our first estimates of non-disclosed parents. Okay, then once we do that, we have to check against minimums. Some values, some estimates, some records have certain minimums, okay? And so if our value, our estimate at this point is lower than the minimum, then we're going to boost it up so it's equal to its minimum. For counties, minimums are based on the sum of their disclosed children. So if we're working on a sector that has children sectors, so that means if we're working on something that's 5-digit or 4-digit or 3-digit or 2-digit, something that has children sectors underneath it, and some of those children are disclosed, well, the sum of those disclosed children is the minimum that the parent can be, right? The parent has to be at least as big as disclosed children. So that's the minimum when we're talking about counties. Now for states, they've got two different things we have to look at for minimums. The sum of their own disclosed children, but also the sum of the constituent counties' disclosed children in that state, because a state value can't be less than its county's values, right? So for states, we have to look at two different ones. And so we calculate these two different minimums, and whichever minimum is bigger, we know that the state value has to be at least that. Okay, so we'll check against minimums. We'll boost things up if we need to. Then we go top down. We distribute parents' leftover value to their non-disclosed children. And this gets a little complicated. It's not a simple proportional distribution, because then we could yield some, child sector estimates that end up being less than their minimum. So we don't do just straight up proportional distribution. Instead, here we have to pay attention once again to minimum values. So we're distributing the parents' leftover, and what the leftover value is the parents' value minus the sum of disclosed children value, because we don't change disclosed values. So we can't distribute those disclosed children's value to anybody else. They got to keep their value. So parent value minus the sum of disclosed children minus the sum of the non-disclosed children's minimums. Okay, so then that's kind of extra. Then that extra employment, whatever is above and beyond that, then we get to distribute that extra employment among the non-disclosed children, and we just add that extra, some proportion of that extra value to the non-disclosed children. So non-disclosed children are always at least their minimum, and then they might get some extra employment too if the parent value has some extra left over to give after we've subtracted off the sum of disclosed children's values and those non-disclosed children minimum. So it's a little complicated, but I'm going to hop into Excel and show you this a little bit in Excel. And I also want to point out that this Excel spreadsheet is going to accompany this video. So look down in the notes with section of this video, and you'll see a link to this spreadsheet so that you can actually take your time and go in here and look at the formulas and walk through it yourself if you would like to. So let's hop into the spreadsheet, and you'll see in the spreadsheet that I have several tabs, and each of those tabs kind of relates to one of the stages of this estimation that we've talked about. In this first tab, we're just trying to get the first estimates. So there's a lot of data in here, but we're just going to go through it one by one. So in the upper left corner is the raw data. This is real raw CEW data from 2002 for a random county, state FIPS 24, county FIPS 3, and a handful of NAICS codes, okay? And you'll see that all of the values except one are non-disclosed. So that means we have a lot of work to do. And so just to the right of that, you're going to see my first estimates, and I've listed the method that we used to get that first estimate. And those are the estimates or methods that we have just talked about. And so all this data below here are the data we're going to use to make those first estimates. Okay, so let's look at the first case for NAICS code 22. It says here that I used the CBP method, and we'll see why. Remember, our first choice is to look at 1 year lagged CEW data and hope that it was disclosed, and we can just project it using the state growth rate. Well, if I look at last year's data, you can see it's for 2001 data. I look at, for the same county, same state, I look at NAICS code 2, shoot, it was non-disclosed last year too, or the previous year as well. So I can't use that method. So I go to the tier 2 method, second choice, which is to turn to the CBP data. So I'm going to go down here and look at the CBP data, which remember is 1 year lagged. And for NAICS code 22, sure enough, I have an employment number. It was disclosed. So I can use the second choice method. And if you recall, it was to use the employment per establishment from CBP and multiply it by this year's CEW's establishment count. So in this case, so I'm going to click on my first estimate. What it yields us is 15.2. I'm going to highlight the formula there just so you can see the cells involved and you can see the formula. I'm multiplying 9 establishments, which is this year's CEW count of establishments, times the CBP ratio of employment per establishment. And that gives me a first estimate of 15.2 jobs. Okay. Same method was used for the next 3 records. We don't need to talk about them. But I would like to talk about this one, which is NAICS code 221111. In this case, if I look at last year's data, raw data, 221111, it was not disclosed. Can't use that method. Go to method number 2, which is CBP data. Well, look at the CBP data. It doesn't even have a record at all for NAICS code 221111. So I can't use the CBP method. Okay, so now let's look at state. This is the state data up here for current 2002 in this case. Looking at the state for NAICS code 221111. But look at that. It was even the state value is non-disclosed. So now I have to go to my last resort US ratio, and that's what I end up doing. So if I click on that first estimate, 46.1 is what it ends up being, and I'll click on the formula, you can see that here I'm using the US data down here, using its ratio of employment per establishment, multiplying it by our current establishment count for the county. But if you look at my formula, you'll notice that I also multiplied it by 0.9. I didn't mention that previously, but that is a nuance we add to sort of handicap it. We're just going to say, let's just tamp down a little bit our first estimate of employment for the county. We'll assume that the employment per establishment is a little bit lower for the county than it is for the US average as a whole. Okay, so we do that. That's just part of our nuance of how we do this. And then you'll see that the NAICS code below that, 221112, we were able to use a projected lagged raw value. We were able to use our first choice because the previous year's raw number was disclosed. And so we can just apply the state's growth rate to that and get an employment estimate for this year. So if you look at the state values here, you can see that the industry in the state actually shrunk a little bit. So our growth rate is less than 1. And so in the county, we're going to end up with an estimate that's something less than 2, because last year's employment was 2, and we're applying a state growth rate that's less than 1. And sure enough, our first estimate is 1.9. And then the last 2, we used CBP data again, so we don't need to belabor those. Okay, so we have our lovely first estimates here. Now remember, the next step is to go bottom up, and so we'll do that. We're going to move to the second tab here. And so bottom up, remember we go each level of NAICS. So starting at the bottom means we need to make sure that the 5-digit codes are equal to the sum of their children. We either replace them with the sum of the children if that's bigger, or we leave them with their first estimate. So for this particular 5-digit code, its first estimate was 5, and its only child sector's first estimate was 5. So it just stays with 5. Fine. But for this 5-digit code, our first estimate for it was just 1.3 jobs. But look at the estimate of the children. The sum of the children, their first estimates is higher. So we're going to replace our parent value with that sum. Okay, and then we go to the 4-digit parent, and our first estimate for it was 5.8. That is smaller than the sum of its children as we're going bottom up. So we're going to replace it with the sum of the children. So it now has an estimate of 52.96. Then we go to the 3-digit. This one's kind of interesting because at the 3-digit parent, we now have a 4-digit child sector that was disclosed. So we got to grab its value, add it to the sum of, add it to our estimate, summed up estimate for the other 4-digit parent, 4-digit sector, and we get a sum that is 69.96. That's higher than our first estimate for the 3-digit sector of 15.2. So we're going to replace it and give it this new number of 69.96. And then our 2-digit parent is that same value because the 2-digit parent only has one 3-digit child. So we can just have that estimate because that's bigger than our first estimate of 15.2. Okay, so that's our bottom up. Now we're going to move to the next tab where we compare to minimums. In this case, we only had 2 sectors that actually had minimums, and those minimums are below our current estimates for these sectors. So in this case, nothing has been adjusted. We didn't need to make any adjustments. We didn't need to bump anyone up to be over their minimum. So this was kind of a nothing thing in this case. However, we still need to pay attention to those minimums because if you remember, they're going to be involved in going top down. Okay, so top down, we need to take we need to take parents' values and distribute them down. But here's where it gets a little complicated. I didn't tell you this yet, but do you see how industry 22 is non-disclosed? So to go top down and get the final estimate for NAICS code 22, we have to pay attention to its parent and any other non-disclosed values under that parent. So it gets kind of nasty here in the next tab. So we're going to go top down first, going even higher up in NAICS levels and getting the final estimate for 22. Then in the tab after that, we're going to take 22's final value and distribute that to its children, okay? So let's go to the next tab. And here in this, what I've done here is pulled all the raw data for all the 2-digit NAICS codes, with NAICS code 10 being the top. That means all industries, okay? And you'll see that here's our non-disclosed NAICS code 22, but there's another 2-digit NAICS code that's non-disclosed, NAICS code 42. So before I can get the final value for industry 22, I got to get the first value and the bottom up and all of that for industry 42. Okay, so that's what all this is going down here. I grabbed the raw data for industry 42 and all of its children, and I did all the same things that I did in previous tabs for industry 22 and its children. I got their first estimates. See, I got more raw data down here that I used to get the first estimates. Then I did the whole bottom up thing, and then I checked against minimums. Okay, and so that's where that's what these are here, repeated here for these 2 non-disclosed 2-digit NAICS codes. So once I get to a good place for both of those, doing the bottom up, I then get to distribute the leftover. I get to get their final values. I'm basically distributing the leftover from sector 10 less all of its disclosed children. But remember, so, okay, if I just take sector 10's value and subtract off all the disclosed 2-digit codes, I'm left with 8,890. But remember, I don't just straight up distribute that proportionally to sectors 22 and 42 based on their current estimates that we've given them, because we have to pay attention to minimums. And so we kind of have this fancier way to distribute that. So if you recall, I take this leftover, the leftover we have to distribute, and then I subtract off each of these sectors' minimums, and that's really what I end up distributing to them. So I end up with 1,430 jobs that get to be added on to each of these 2 industries' minimum values. And again, you'll have access to the spreadsheet, so you can look at this more closely to do it. But what we end up with for industry 22 is an employment estimate of 34. So note the progression of this number. You'll see it in the deepening greens here. We started with our first estimate of 15. When we went bottom up, we got an estimate of 70. And then when we went top down and paid attention to the sibling sectors and the parent sector, NAICS code 10, in the end, we end up with a final value of 34. So we started low, went a little too high, ended up in the middle. So that's kind of the nuances we have to do. Okay, now we have a final value for NAICS code 22. So in our final tab here, we're distributing that value of 34 among the children of sector 22. And I just wanted to show another progression. I just picked one of these NAICS codes, the 4-digit NAICS code of 2211. Our first estimate for it was 5.8. Then going bottom up, it went up to, shot up to 53. And then once we're paying attention to the parent sector's final values, we end up with 16.9. Again, somewhere kind of in the middle. Okay, so there's a progression here from first estimate to final estimate, and that is how it's done. All right, let me hop back to the spreadsheet for just another, the presentation for another couple slides. So to point out that we have to repeat that for all counties and states and all NAICS levels. So we don't do this by hand in Excel. We do this programmatically. So we write our own code in-house to loop through all geographies and loop through all NAICS levels and loop through all our tiers of options and looking at all the raw data we have available for all of these geographies and all of these NAICS levels, and doing this over and over again. Also recall that we have to do this for all ownership types. The process I just described was for privately owned. It's a very similar process for government owned. The main difference being that the CBP data do not have any government owned establishment information in it. So that is just not an option. We can't turn to that. So that tier is just sort of gone. And then also to note that even at the US level, there are some non-disclosures for government owned. So there's a couple extra special things we have to do there. Okay. And then just a note, how are CEW data used in IMPLAN models? You will really not see any of these final CEW numbers in IMPLAN because there's a number of other things that happen to get final values into the IMPLAN impact tool. Okay, so one is to adjust for those undercovered sectors. And so we will turn to different data sources, one of them being the Bureau of Economic Analysis's regional economic accounts data, which gives us proprietor income and employment, and it covers other sectors, like it fully covers farm sectors and other things that are kind of, and rail, that are undercovered in CEW, military, things like that. Then we have to bridge to IMPLAN sectoring. So a lot of that will involve aggregating. So we sum up certain NAICS codes to get to an IMPLAN sector, but sometimes it's one-to-one, where a 6-digit NAICS code maps perfectly to an IMPLAN sector. Sometimes it's splitting. Then all of the data have to be controlled to BEA NIPA control totals, National Income and Product Accounts tables. Those tables don't have any industry detail, but they do have the total proprietor employment at the US for that year, and total wage and salary employment, total wage and salary income, stuff like that. So everything has to sum up to those US totals. So some adjustment there happens to county and state values. And then there's a process called redefinitions, and we have a nice article for this on our support site if you want to look into it anymore. But the basic idea is that establishments that have kind of two activities, like a casino hotel, the casino part of that hotel, the employment and wages associated with the casino, really don't belong in the hotel industry. They need to go to the gambling industry. So there's some movement of activity from one industry to another in cases like that. So just to note that when you're looking at an IMPLAN model in the impact tool, you're not going to see any of the CEW numbers just as they are in our fully disclosed CEW data product, which lives in data library. Okay, so the fully disclosed CEW data that are in data library don't include all of these above adjustments. They maintain their original CEW identity. The only difference between them and the raw CEW data from BLS is that we filled in the holes. We filled in those. We've added estimates for those non-disclosed numbers. Okay, finally, I just want to point out a couple additional resources on our support site, which is support.implan.com. We have several articles and things that'll just give you more information about the CEW if you want to dig in further. So I've put in the pathways here. If you go to support.implan.com, this is the next thing you do is click references, data, and then beyond IO and IMPLAN. And references, data sources and estimation methods, and that'll get you there. And then looking at it in specifically to look at it in data library and know kind of how to slice and dice it. Data library, for those of you not familiar, has our data from 2001 to the current IMPLAN data year, and you can do visualizations, you can make line graphs, you can compare across geographies, across time. If you want to learn a little bit more about accessing the CEW data in data library, you can click on getting started and then data library. And that's all I have for this video. Thank you all so much for watching, and until next time.